I've got Adam Creighton, and I wanted to get him on. You know, he's the economics editor at the Australian newspaper, but there's been a lot of talk. We saw yesterday the RBA being advised by the Bank for International Settlements that they need to mobilise all forces, they say, to save the economy from the threat of climate change. I want to get Adam on for his view because the BIS suggested that the RBA may need to buy up coal mines and fossil fuel power stations here in Australia to economically move through what they claim is potential climate-induced disaster. Now, I have to say this, all of these debates happen while global billionaires and financial sector players, as well as plenty of rock stars and celebrities, and a notable 16-year-old activist, all descend on Davos in the Swiss Alps for the annual Talkfest. And while they were all told to get there by trains to save on CO2 emissions, most, as usual, and I have been there, I'm telling you, this is how it is. They arrive via private choppers and luxury limousines to give us all the benefit of their wisdom. So what should we make of it all? Adam Creighton joins me now. Adam, great to have you on the show. Welcome back for 2020.
No, thank you. Good to be here.
Let's start with all the lecturing we're getting from international organisations, BIS and others. The IMF's had their say as well. How seriously should we take these economic warnings from globalists on climate change?
Oh, look, not very seriously at all. I was actually surprised at the attention that these reports have been getting. I mean, the link between the impact of climate change on the economy is extremely hard to forecast. I mean, it's hard enough to forecast the link, of course, between emissions and the climate itself, but to go from the climate to the economy is very difficult. We just don't know which way it's going to go. You know, we don't know what it means for interest rates, you know, for instance. And, you know, frankly, central banks and prudential regulators, you know, they really have enough on their hands at the moment without having to worry about what might happen in 2030 or 2040. I mean, really, I think this is just a function of the fact that these international bureaucracies just have so many staff. They need to have something to write about. Actually, the first thing I thought when I read this story was, look, back in the 1960s, there was the threat of nuclear war, of course, in the world, and that obviously was, you know, a far bigger threat to the financial system than you know, maybe climate change in 2050. And yet, of course, back then there were not these endless reports about, you know, the need to incorporate it into our monetary targets. So I just think, you know, I think they're pretty absurd, really.
Well, I think they're a self-justification mechanism. I've seen it in certainly other areas of national policy and finance, you know, is no different. But I'm interested in the argument in relation to buying up assets of coal-fired power stations and also coal mines. What's the advice? The RBA buys them up to shut them down? What's the argument?
Well, look, it's very unclear, actually, and I think it's completely unnecessary. I mean, these assets, sure, they're subject to various risks. They're largely privately owned. The owners of those assets would be fully aware of these risks, and they'd be reflected in the current market pricing. The idea that central banks are going to come in and, you know, buy a coal mine is, I think, completely absurd, and I'm pretty sure the Treasurer's already shot that down, at least in this country. I think central banks are overextended already with their various quantitative easing programs around the world. Of course, not here yet, and to be adding another bow to it, the prospect of another risk, another arbitrary risk in the economy that central banks might decide to purchase a particular asset is ridiculous, I think. You know, the idea that, in any case, the premise that there's some sort of great risk to the financial system because a set of fossil fuel assets might be worth less, I think is extreme assumption, basically.
Your paper today also ran quite a significant story, caught my eye, in relation to warnings from the Queensland Investment Corporation that a fall, quite a significant fall, substantial fall in investment in renewable technology is going to put the grid at risk, power supply at risk, and it will mean congestion problems, they argue, into the future. Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, look, that was a really interesting story. I was shocked at the collapse. I think it was something like a 95% fall in the scheduled additional renewable output, if you like, this financial year compared to last. I mean, it was a reminder to me that, you know, there's so little thinking has gone into the actual economics and science of renewable energy compared to the great gusto that the various targets are put in place. I mean, Victoria, for instance, has something like a 50% renewable energy target by 2030, which is only 10 years away. And it just seems that this is just not going to be feasible. The other thing that jumped out to me was that, you know, we keep hearing how cost-effective renewable energy is, but, you know, that doesn't incorporate changes to the grid that have to occur if we're going to have massive wind farms. I mean, of course, it's much easier to channel power from a gas or coal-fired power station into the grid because it's at a discrete location. It's a relatively small space. But when it's happening from a wind farm, it's a very, very costly exercise.
Right, I want to move on to some other issues. I mentioned Davos at the start. It was sort of tongue-in-cheek, but not so much. I've been there in and around this circus, and I know exactly the level of posturing that goes on. Lectures from billionaires about how we deal with climate change and poverty when neither issue will touch them in any meaningful sense. That comes at a time, I mean, Donald Trump was there, quite a rousing speech from him. It wouldn't have been well received in the room, but it certainly will retail well back in the US. It comes at a time that there was a deal, phase one deal they call it, between the United States and China on trade. We saw a significant boost in the US share market out of it. What did you make of the announcement?
Well, certainly it's a mixed blessing for us. I think we've been benefiting actually quite a lot from the trade war between the US and China. I mean, if you look at our almond exports, for instance, or cotton, and certainly our LNG exports, they've all been benefiting because China has basically had to buy more from us than they otherwise would have. China's promised as part of this deal to buy an extra $200 billion worth of goods from the US over the next 2 years. That is a lot. It's certainly a lot more than they were buying before the trade war started. So if they fulfill that promise and they do divert various energy purchases to the US, that is in the short term going to be bad for us. But I think in the longer term, it's a good thing that there's a relaxation of tension there between the world's two largest economies. But I'm just a bit sceptical that this deal is more about politics than about economics, really. I think there's a long way to go in these negotiations yet. I mean, for instance, on the issue of technology transfer, forced technology transfer, it simply says in the agreement that China will refrain from doing that. That's all. It's very vague. There's really no way of checking whether they have complied or not. And indeed, even the export purchase thresholds that have to be met, these all occur after the US presidential election. And so I really think that this is all about, as you suggested earlier, basically keeping the US stock market high and giving Donald Trump a good ride into the presidential election this year.
Yeah, well, in and around all the other carry-on with the impeachment trial that's just underway in the Senate too. You know, this has an international play out. But I know from looking very closely at those Rust Belt seats that are his mainstay in terms of base support, it has a very different effect on the ground and often works very much in his favour at home, not so much away. Let's move into some local issues here because right now in Canberra, federal MPs are all going through the budget process, so people know this at home. The Treasurer and other senior ministers on the Budget Committee sit around a room, the Cabinet room, and they discuss bids for expenditure in the forthcoming financial year and beyond. Ministers all come in, all of them have to front the Treasurer. They have to make their case for spending in health or infrastructure, whatever it might be. There's also a big push on savings, and Matthias Cormann, who's the Finance Minister, has really led that charge ever since the government was first elected back in 2013. Interestingly, I asked the Prime Minister last night whether there was any impact on the budget coming out of the fire crisis and the really heavy expenditure he's been required to make in the last few months. Let's have a listen to what he said. But just on that point you made there about economic security, how much at risk do you think the surplus will be after what's been a pretty catastrophic summer?
Well, we've allocated $2 billion over these next 2 calendar years. $500 million has been profiled for this financial year, and I've got to say, of the $2 billion we've announced, we've already made commitments of more than $500 million, and the overwhelming majority, almost all of that, will occur before the 30th of June this year, because it goes in, the tourism payments and others, which I can go through. But the budget will reconcile what that all means for the surplus at that time of the year, and we'll wait for that time to do that update.
So the point there, I thought, Adam, was really interesting, that there's going to be only $500 million in this financial year, $1.5 billion forward. I think it will probably be in the next financial year, but could well spill over to the second out year. What do you make then of how tight things must be in terms of maintaining the surplus?
Yeah, certainly that's very interesting. I think the government doesn't really need to be concerned. I think the surplus is pretty much in the bag for this financial year. I mean, sure, there's a $2 billion over the next 2 years, as you say. There's going to be some sort of hit to the economy, so that will flow through to income tax collections, but I think in a small way. to be fair. The fact is commodity prices are still so much higher. I think iron ore today is something like $90 when the assumption in the budget from December is something like 60, and so there's already an extra billion or two in the kitty, if you like, that can offset the damage of the bushfires to the budget. So my sense is that the concern that the Prime Minister is expressing, and indeed the Treasurer, is really more of a political concern. It's just trying to tell people that, look, we've been talking about a surplus for a long time, but really now we'd rather talk about the bushfires because that is more important. So I think, when the next update occurs, I think you'll find that there's still quite a sizable surplus, and it could be even larger than the $5 billion actually that is currently penciled in.
Yeah, well, we'll know very soon. The budgets are back out of April, now back into May as they've traditionally been held. So we'll see very shortly where it all lands. Adam Creighton, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Peter.